name is Bob Dorso, and I'd like to welcome you to the 19th Annual Mayor's Breakfast. Our topic this year is Brownfields, a golden business opportunity. At this time, I'd like to invite Irene Conti from Investors Bank to the front to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Before we begin our program, I'd like to take this moment to thank our generous sponsors, Bayshore Family of Companies, BCB Community Bank of Woodbridge, Berkeley College, CME Associates, Columbia Bank, DeCoitis, Fitzpatrick, Coyle, and Giblin, Hotels Unlimited and TFE Properties, Ideal Homes, Investors Bank, James P. Nolan and Associates, McMahon, Scotland and Bowman, Northfield Bank, Peak Environmental, Remington Voigt, Selective Benefits Group, SJP Properties, T&M Associates, the Hampshire Companies, Wegmans, Willens, Goldman and Spitzer, and Woodbridge Center Mall. Thank you all for your generous support. At this time, I just want to remind you about some upcoming events. October 17th, we have our Chairman's Awards dinner. This year, we have an exceptional group of honorees. October 20th, Expo Business to Consumer event at Woodbridge Center Mall. December 10th, our annual holiday luncheon. As always, it's an honor and a privilege for me to stand before you and introduce what would be the greatest mayor in all the land. Mayor John McCormick.
What can I say? Bob is very perceptive. I want to thank the Country Club for making this wonderful facility available. The place is packed, the parking lot's packed. This is a huge crowd. We're so thrilled that you're all here. I also want to thank the Chamber of Commerce. We have done so many good things together over the last several years. We're doing some great things coming up. Bob failed to mention the restaurant week that the Chamber's putting on in, is it October? No, it's November, 5th to 11th. Did I get that right? Yeah. Something like that. But a whole lot of great things happen in town because the Chamber and the Town Council and the Mayor's Office all work together. Speaking of our Town Council, we have, I think, 4 of them in the audience: Nancy Drum, Howie Bauer, Debbie Mead, and Brian Small. Would you all please stand up? From our Board of Education, we have our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Bob Zaga. And from the Board of Education, we have Brian Molnar. And we have a whole host of people that run the best town around, which is Woodbridge. Anybody, if you work for the town or the Board of Ed, just please stand up and be recognized. We also have some other mayors in the town, in the house, I should say. From South Amboy, Fred Henry's in the house. There he is. And from South Brunswick, Charlie Carley's the mayor, and Joe Camarada is the deputy mayor. Where's Charlie? Somewhere. We also have former Chief of Staff and former Public Works Director, who's now the Business Administrator of Piscataway, Tim Dacey. I don't see any of our current legislators, but former Assemblyman John Wisniewski, 19th District. The Township of Woodbridge has really been an example of how to deal with brownfields. We've had so many areas of town that were contaminated, polluted, that have been cleaned up. You'll see all about it today. You'll see the CTV site in Catesby. If you see white guys in white suits, out of sight, you know you got a problem. So in Catesby, we had completely cleaned up probably what was the worst site in town. And then I'd say probably the second worst site in town was Avenel and General Dynamics, where there was some significant contamination. All cleaned up, as well as a dozen other projects. The woman responsible for economic development in the township of Woodbridge needs no introduction herself. She, for the last nearly 12 years, has really put Woodbridge on the map. We're known for being business friendly. We're known for being a town where you can get in and out and get through the boards and get through the system quite easily. We're also known for a town where if you come to us and talk to us in advance, we'll tell you what we like and what we don't like before you spend a lot of money. So there's a whole lot of great things happening in this town. It all comes down to the economic development, and the person responsible for that is our moderator today, my best friend, Carolyn Ehrlich.
Those were very kind words by the mayor, but he always refers to me as his left hand and always refers to Marta Levsky as his right hand, and she's my right hand, and we are a partnership and we do everything together. So Marta, thank you. Before we begin, I want to do a little plug for, as you know, we are a green town, and we are actually a champion for sustainable Jersey. So we're always pulling out new things that we can do to become more sustainable. And the town, pretty much, we do as much as we can almost. So now we're trying to get our businesses to take action. So you will see on your table, there's a little checklist. If you do 10 things on that checklist, we are going to give you a certificate to hang on your wall and some other forms of recognition. People who give the most checks will get super green awards. So please, you can fill it out as you're sitting here and give it to Megan. Megan, please stand up so you know who to give it to. And so I would appreciate it if you could take part in this little survey. And if there are things on there that you go, huh, how do you do that? Just ask us and we'll let you know. So getting to the program and talking about Brownfields. I love the title for this, Brownfields, a golden business opportunity. For Woodbridge, they've actually been a gold mine. By cleaning up the brownfields, we take care of the environmental contamination, but it's also a tremendous economic driver, bringing jobs to town, new businesses to town, and more rateables. We have been able to do so many things for our residents, for our schools, because of the cleaning up the brownfields, getting people to come in and develop them, and then by giving them incentives as pilot programs. So this has been a gold mine that we have all really enjoyed, and a lot of people sitting out here in the audience have been miners for us, helping us clean up the brownfields and making us all more prosperous. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. First up, we have Peak Environmental. Peak does a lot of the township work. We are constantly buying buildings and things, and we'll pull them out and we'll say, do the testing, let us know how bad this is, how much work we have to do, and Peak has been great with that. Speaking on behalf of Peak is Rob Edgar and Jeffrey Campbell. Larry Jacobs is an attorney with Wilentz, Goldman, Spitzer. And they actually do more of representing the developers coming in, and hardly anybody comes in without one of them. And they're really, really good. And one of the things I say about the Wilentz attorneys is they're a pain in our neck, which means that they're really good for their clients. So they've spent a lot of time preparing this slide presentation, these speeches. So I'm going to shut up and give the microphone to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Good morning, everyone. It's
First, I want to thank and acknowledge Mayor McCormick, Carolyn Ehrlich, Karen Barnes, and the Woodbridge Chamber of Commerce, Councilwoman Nancy Drum, and my co-presenters Larry Jacobs from Wilentz, Goldman & Spitzer, and my partner Jeff Campbell at Peak Environmental. Like most Fortune 500 companies, Peak began at a kitchen table. It was specifically the kitchen table of our founder, Ken Newenhouse, located less than a mile from where we're all sitting right now. Peak grew up in Woodbridge, and many of our clients were members of this very club. Peak has grown to 40 professionals, including 10 LSRPs. There are no degrees that are given to LSRPs by universities, so each of our LSRPs, our licensed site remediation professionals, have a different degree. They have a varied educational background, and that varied background helps them basically tackle the site remediation program and the different aspects of that program that they're in charge of. Our clients include developers, lenders, government entities, commercial property owners, and industrial facilities.
Good morning, Rob. Thanks for the introduction. And as Rob mentioned, we've been working on this program with Carol and the Chamber for, it seems like, a few years. The program's evolved. And during that time, Wilentz has actually aged almost 100 years. And we will be closely following Woodbridge in its 350th anniversary with our own 100-year anniversary as a law firm in Middlesex County and established right here in Woodbridge. Over at our table over there, we have a good representation of our land use and real estate attorneys who we work with from the environmental side. As Carol mentioned, we work with and in close coordination, and sometimes it's happy coordination with the city administration. But what's notable is the work that's happened here in Woodbridge, and we're going to run through a lot of examples of how the current LSRP program works with redevelopment and pushing economic progress. And Carol and the mayor are leaders, not just in the county and not just in the state, but really I think you look at Woodbridge and this should be a shining exemplar for the nation in taking on brownfields and putting them into productive use. Caroline had mentioned that we represent developers, but Caroline, we've also had meetings where we represent property owners of land that the city would like to see redeveloped. So we really work with the city on both sides, from property owners of sites that are slated for redevelopment and also from the redevelopers who are taking on that redevelopment. And with that, I will just pass it back to Rob and Jeff, and let's start the program.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Let's see, you got the right slide up? Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'd like to acknowledge the Peak table up front here. We have a whole bunch of our staff here staring us down. So welcome, everyone. A large component of the Brownfields program is obviously the LSRP, which is a licensed professional that can get you through the process. So the first question we're going to answer today really is, when do I actually need an LSRP? And the short answer is that an LSRP has to be retained when you have an actual release of a hazardous substance to the environment. And when a release to the environment is confirmed, which typically happens through any of these scenarios in the middle of the slide here, then you obviously have to report that. The Spill Act is applicable, and it starts a process, the beginning of which is to hire an LSRP and initiate remediation under the rules. So redevelopment is really just one scenario in a universe of triggers that can get you into the LSRP program. Industrial facilities regulated by the Industrial Site Recovery Act are an important driver as well. Due diligence for property transactions that Larry had mentioned. Underground storage tanks are things we see a lot of, and they're all typically components of a redevelopment as well as being triggers themselves for getting it into the LSRP program. And regarding redevelopments in general, I'm sure everyone's been seeing the shift toward an endpoint of industrial use has become very popular, and it's a real sign of the economic times. And Woodbridge has obviously seen their share of that land use as well. But at the end of the day, meeting environmental standards, if it is a non-industrial use, can be a bit easier, and we'll cover some of that later. So the next question to answer really is, what is a brownfield? And the definition typically contains two primary components. One is that the property is really underutilized, or it's actually vacant, and it's probably contaminated. But as Woodbridge has realized, there is potential and realized potential here in Woodbridge to turn these properties around and back into productive use. Government agencies at all levels have recognized this and really have prioritized it in their community planning, to the point where the state of New Jersey uses the term critical in terms of brownfields redevelopment, making the state more economically, environmentally viable. A brownfield property can be located in an official New Jersey DEP designated brownfields development area, of which there's multiple of them scattered about the state. They can be within an area in need of redevelopment as defined by a local government agency, or they can just be a standard private property transaction. But regardless of the location of the property, the program has gotten to the point where you have economic incentives, innocent purchaser protection, streamlined environmental and local regulatory processes, a motivated local government, all these things, good insurance products, all those things come together to make a really strong program, and that is really what has made Woodbridge successful in that aspect.
Well, if we can just actually stop right there. The definition, why is the definition important? And it's important because of what Jeff hit upon, is because there are incentives. There are state incentives and incentives that not only come directly from the state, but flow through the state, through the municipality. So come back to that definition. Look, it says it's contaminated. It's known to be contaminated. We know it's contaminated, right? We have samples. But it's also suspected to be contaminated. So sometimes, just because of its prior industrial use, it is assumed to be contaminated. It doesn't mean it actually is. And this is when you have to hire the consultants to come out to determine, one, is it contaminated? So look at that definition, suspected. Doesn't mean it has to be demonstrated with contamination. It just has to have the specter or suspicion that it's contaminated. So that derives in how expensive the remediation of the site is going to be, or if the site even requires remediation. So I just want to point that out. It's something that we often just gloss over, but it brings it back to the evaluation of the property. When you start the brownfield process, can you get the funds? Can you get the investigation grants? Can you get the remediation grants? Can the municipality take advantage? But the first step is establishing its brownfield and looking at the industrial use before you even come to contamination determination.
All right, thank you, Larry. I think it's back to you, Rob.
So how do we clean up brownfield sites? Back in the old days, big or small, every site had an NJDEP case manager assigned. Those case managers had tremendous backloads. They were overworked. The process would begin with us preparing some kind of form or a work plan or a report. This was a paper document. It was sent in triplicate to the state. The state would review it. They would comment on it. They usually had comments on it. They would send those comments back, and this back and forth, just to get a work plan approved, took months, sometimes years. The work couldn't begin until that approval was received by DEP, and upon completion of a work plan approval, the work was performed, and a new report, in paper, in triplicate, was sent into the department, and the process started all over again. At the end of the process, what everybody was looking for was a no further action letter that would be issued by the DEP. The time frame to get to that no further action letter could be years or decades. Luckily, the state of New Jersey realized that this was untenable. They realized the inefficiencies in this process, And in 2009, the Site Remediation Reform Act was passed. We call it SARA. That act included an affirmative obligation for persons responsible for conducting the remediation, PRCRs, to remediate contaminated properties. And SARA privatized remediation oversight by creating the licensed site remediation professional. We have a licensing board that governs the licensing of LSRPs and our performance. We have to comply with regulations and guidance. We have to perform cleanups using presumptive remedies, which are remedies that are laid out by DEP. And all this work has to be done within regulatory timeframes. We're given a total of maybe 10 years to identify and clean up a site. LSRPs manage environmental liabilities. We avoid, or help our clients avoid, what could otherwise be very significant fines by DEP. And we juggle all these NJDEP compliance deadlines while meeting a very voluminous administrative requirement on the part of the department. There's 1 million forms we have to fill out, and there are many milestones that we have to meet. We advocate for our clients as LSRPs to achieve their goals. And we act as DEP, as LSRPs, but we're also a liaison to DEP, liaison to the municipality and to the general public. And then we assist our clients in getting financial options, HDR, SRF loans, Brownfield funds, or other financial incentives. And ultimately, we close cases. We close cases by issuing what is now called a Response Action Outcome, an RAO. And that RAO is in place the moment it's issued. The minute I sign an RAO and my client receives it, that RAO is valid. And the RAO replaces a no further action letter. The DEP will still issue no further action letters for a very small percentage of cases that are UHA cases. They're usually residential or small capacity commercial heating oil underground storage tanks, but that's it.
So I just want to hit on one issue, and it was actually the prior slide, the old days. So how many folks went through a remediation process with DEP? There's got to be some hands out here. Okay. So if you all remember that process, you hired a consultant, you submitted a report. It might be your investigation report. DEP would give comments. You would work with your consultant and your attorney to respond to those comments. Send another submission back to DEP. DEP would send another round of comments back to you. You would work with your consultant and your attorney to get another response back, and you go back and forth and back and forth. It costs a lot of money in professional fees for that iterative back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it also took time. And frankly, it also dealt the client, the property owner, or the developer a lot of uncertainty in the process because you're always subject to the whim of a third party in the form of the state doing the review of your submissions. The LSRP process cuts it out completely. And luckily for most of the process, you don't have to work with your attorney as much as you used to. You're not spending as much in legal fees because you've got your LSRP, since they are filling in the form, or filling in the steps of DEP, what they say is generally what happens. So you don't have a back and forth with DEP. You don't have the back and forth with your attorney. You can work directly with the LSRP. What they say goes because they are licensed by the state to approve those investigations and to approve and implement the remediations. So you lose the uncertainty that you used to, you lose the expense that you used to face, and you lose the timing and delays that you were faced with before, which means you can coordinate better on the sale and disposition of your property and working with the municipality on getting that property ready for development.
Thanks, Larry. That's a good segue into the LSRP relationship. it's real important to have an LSRP that really knows how to establish an endpoint on a project and can define the pathway to it relatively early. So regardless of the project size, the LSRP should really be included early to define issues or problems that everyone on the team can be aware of and then manage accordingly as the project advances. And so hiring an LSRP, again, following on Larry's lead, is really not just checking a box. I'm not doing it just because I have to. The LSRP is really providing some critical regulatory and technical information that are going to contribute to proper planning and defining endpoints and goals for the project. And early on in the project, you can set up that full project schedule that gets you all the way to the end point as defined by each stakeholder, really, and everyone can be accounted for. The environmental endpoint, obviously, the response action outcome is a key document for everyone involved in the project. Next slide, Rob. Okay, so, is this right? Yeah. Okay, so the LSRP, in given this authority that Larry was talking about, again, really does have some controls on it as built into the law. When they adopted it, the lawmakers did consider the fox guarding the hen house concept. So the law creating the LSRP program does make it very clear that protection of human health and the environment is priority number one for all LSRPs, and there are consequences to not maintaining that responsibility on every project. And this can include license revocations and fines, and these have occurred in the recent past. A code of ethics is embedded in the law as well, and it covers a wide range of issues, a couple of which we listed up here. And they include that an LSRP cannot work outside of their area of expertise, so you want to have a fully staffed consulting firm to support every type of project that comes up or every type of resource that's needed. An LSRP cannot work for conflicting parties unless everyone agrees ahead of time. The LSRP cannot be an employee of a person responsible for conducting a remediation, and the LSRP cannot have a financial interest in the outcome of this property. So we don't include code of conduct as a problem, merely it's another aspect of early planning to make sure everyone at the table is aware of all the roles and responsibilities of the LSRP and making those decisions for them.
And one of the things that I want to point out is that with the code of conduct and the presumptive remedies, and DEP's got a host of regulations that Rob is probably going to head into next, it doesn't mean that LSRPs are all equivalent robots. They all come into projects with different experience, different education, and different approaches. There are LSRPs that are super conservative and may say, we need 50 samples for every pollutant for that one issue. And there may be another LSRP that takes a different approach. So even with the code of conduct, even with the regulations and the frameworks established by DEP that the LSRPs must work within a box, there's still enough flexibility that you need to know what your LSRP is like and whether or not that LSRP is appropriate for your risk level and your project. And I just want to point that out, that once again, there are LSRPs within firms that might take things a little differently. There are LSRPs from other firms that might look at things differently. And when this comes to, when it comes to the fore, it really is when you're in a situation, usually redevelopment situation, there may be an LSRP for a property owner, and there's an LSRP for the developer, and this municipality may have its own LSRP with different ideas of how the remediation should go. And it's something that we often see in the Brownsfields scenario, and it involves coordination between all the parties. But I do want to point that out, that after what Jeff said, I don't want everyone thinking like, okay, right, we hired one LSRP, that's it, it'll be the same as hiring any other one. There's still enough flexibility in there that LSRPs get to exercise professional judgment, and everyone's professional judgment is based on their own experience.
Thanks, Larry. We will cover some of those details. So LSRPs operate within a regulatory framework. We have literally hundreds of state and federal rules, regulations, and guidance that we have to work with. There's an enormous amount of rules, regulations, and guidance that we have to consider. These guidance documents and regulations are updated periodically, very frequently in New Jersey, so we have to be cognizant of those updates. And then as LSRPs, we're asked to consider guidance from other states in addition to everything in New Jersey. So there's a lot for us to consider. Luckily, we have some tools that give us some degree of sanity when we're navigating all these regulations. And as Larry just said, the biggest tool we have is really using our professional judgment to decide when enough is enough, when we've taken enough samples and we can draw a conclusion. We also have attainment options. We have different tools that we can use to demonstrate that clean is clean enough. We can create site-specific impact to groundwater standards. We can average contamination with a number of tools in our averaging tool belt. We can average groundwater samples, and we can calculate site-specific groundwater screening levels, which are a measure of whether or not a vapor intrusion investigation needs to take place. We can use tools like fate and transport modeling and statistical analysis to look at how big a plume is, where a plume of contamination might go in the future, and we can also determine whether it's likely to degrade over time and require no active remediation. These tools are also used if we have a situation where we have a commingled plume. You might have someone else's contamination migrating onto your property. You don't want to have to remediate someone else's problem. We can differentiate between those plumes using these tools. And then we have long-term management options. We don't have to clean up every molecule of contamination. We can leave contamination in place as long as it's protective. And the tools that we use to do that are classification exception areas for groundwater, engineering controls for soil and groundwater, and an institutional control, which is a deed notice. Anytime we use these controls, we have to get a permit from the state to allow that contamination to remain in place, and that's called a remedial action permit. And then we also have options now in the backfill we use and the end point of fill we generate when we dig something up. It's called alternative fill. It's usually contaminated material. It can be exported to another site that has similar contaminants at similar levels, like on like, or you can backfill your excavation or bring your site up a little bit using alternative fill. Again, you have to meet that like on like requirement. So there's now a market for contaminated fill to be used on redevelopment sites. And our compliance option tools continue to expand. Most recently, DEP has allowed us to cap volatile organic compounds. These are compounds like a discharge from a gasoline underground storage tank. In the past, DEP had absolutely said, no, you cannot leave volatile organic compound impacted soil in place for fear that it would impact groundwater in the future. But we've convinced the department that that can happen as long as we're not impacting groundwater in the long term.
Okay, so this one is the holy grail of the environmental process. How many people in the room have asked or have been asked, where is my RAO? A few? Well, you'll learn the process if you get into some redevelopment. I got asked this morning, actually, from, isn't that right, Mr. Harrison? I got asked about when the endpoint is on one of my projects. So it's really that most important document when it comes to the transaction and getting to the endpoint of the redevelopment. But in a way, it's also part of the compliance tools that the LSRP has to work with. And because the endpoint of one of these alternative uses of the RAO can be planned for very early in the project. So an RAO can address the entire site, it can address just a specific area of environmental concern on that site, or it can just address a leasehold space when an industrial use has moved out. It can be an unrestricted RAO, which means all the cleanup has attained levels that are less than all regulatory standards, so there's no restrictions on the property. Or the restricted use RAO in combination with some of the tools Rob spoke about allow you to leave contamination on site and then manage that contamination longer term. if it works for a particular project, you can RAO only soils on that particular property and to keep your project moving. DEP is also, and I believe they keep adding more notices that you can put in your RAO, and these are for issues that you want to be recognized as environmental issues and not forgotten about, but they don't need to be remediated right away. You can put them on hold for later, and that can be historic fill, it can be a railroad siding that's next to your property, it can be groundwater contamination migrating onto your property, things like that. When an RAO is a restricted RAO, you do need to include a remedial action permit, and that's the regulatory vehicle for managing long-term contamination that will remain on the site, and that requires some financial assurance and certain posting of that assurance. But it gives you options in your endpoints. And then the legal perspective is that the RAO gets issued from the LSRP to the person responsible for conducting the remediation. How the law works, it has to happen that way, and then there's reliance and such things that attorneys can speak to as needed. And the DEP has developed model language that has to go in the RAO. They do not allow modifications to that language without their prior approval. And it's my understanding that that does not happen very often.
Rob mentioned earlier that the document that used to be the final indication that the remediation was complete was the no further action letter. No further action letter included language that was a covenant not to sue. That so long as the no further action was validly issued, DEP, the state of New Jersey, would not sue anyone who relied on that no further action letter. It's built right into the no further action. The NFA had it right in there. The RAO doesn't say that. It doesn't say covenant not to sue. However, the law, the SRRA, the Site Remediation Reform Act that Rob mentioned earlier, by law says that all RAOs include a covenant not to sue for the issues addressed and covered by the RAO. So the RAO doesn't look like the NFA, but as a matter of law, it really is a stand-in equivalent.
Thanks, Larry. Just one more point on it. In terms of the RAO being a tool for the LSRP, you have this variety of endpoints that are available to you, so it really allows flexibility early in the process where you can match environmental solutions on a given property or site or redevelopment area with land use plans, shifting things around to get to a particular endpoint or solution for an environmental aspect of the property. Okay, so the LSRP program does get measured for success. Some metrics that are tracked by the DEP would be useful to give you an idea of the size of the program here in New Jersey. There's almost 700 LSRPs, and they're managing about 14,000 active cases. But the real measure of success is how many are actually exiting the program. That's what got the program going, is none were coming out in the quote old days. And as you can see, LSRPs have issued over 12,000 RAOs. At peak, 10 LSRPs, we've done several hundred. So we certainly buy into the program. Everyone in the industry says it's a success, and it's really a matter of getting the right tools in the right people's hands that can make the decisions on these projects and keep them moving, and off you go.
So this slide actually deals with the redevelopment steps, and once again, if there's a property that's been slated for redevelopment, whether directly by the municipality or by a property owner seeking to reposition the property, or by a developer who sees a potential redevelopment opportunity, that first step is looking at it, right? And when we're talking about properties, for purposes of this presentation, we're talking about brownfield sites. So once again, a site that is known to be contaminated or suspected to be contaminated because of its prior use, usually industrial use. So the first step, what do you got out there? What are you going to do with it? right? Assessing the current state of the property, what it is going to become. And that involves putting your team together, so that means your environmental consultants to assess the property, your planners, your engineers to see what you can do with the property, your lawyers to look at both the environmental issues, the real estate issues associated with taking on the project, and what you can do with it in the end, and whether or not the zoning or the redevelopment plan is consistent with those uses and what you need to run through that program. And certainly, once again, part of the project team is working with the municipality. Don't start going in a direction that is counter to the municipality's goals for that site. Because if you do, you're not going to get very far, are you, Carolyn? No. Some of the other issues that are identified with brownfield projects, once again, earlier Rob mentioned the brownfield development areas. Woodbridge has a BDA. Being in a BDA offers you certain incentives. So once again, your project team could involve coordination both here locally with your own professional team, and then if it's a BDA, coordination with DEP to take advantage of some of the brownfield programs and incentives that are offered to properties that are located in BDA areas. As with any real estate transaction, it's the due diligence effort. That's where, is it contaminated? If it is contaminated, how much is it going to take me to remediate? That's what clients usually want to know. How much and how quickly can I get to a remediation endpoint? But as you work with consultants, there's different levels of remediation. Jeff earlier mentioned the restricted REO, which means that there's some contamination left in place, and it could be capped. It may not be capped, but there's some remediation there, and that could impact the long-term uses of that site. Or there's the unrestricted use, which means that the site is ready for any use. Generally, it's residential is regarded as the strictest remediation standard, although not always. But residential, if you hit that goal, then you can put in houses. The dirt is clean. You don't need any controls to have kids playing on that yard. So that's something that you look in the due diligence element to assess where you're going. And the reason that's important is because it's a timing and cost issue. The redevelopment process, as we've certainly discovered here in Woodbridge, there are uses that are in line with the current situation at the site. In other words, if it's contaminated, is it ready to go from industrial use to industrial use? But if it's converting from an industrial use to something else, then what do you need to get there? And how much is it going to take? And are there opportunities to allocate the expenses? And some of the redevelopment projects that the mayor and Caroline mentioned earlier involve many of those elements. One that Caroline and I were just discussing was the General Dynamics site. So there we had a case with a property owner, we had a remediating party in the form of General Dynamics, and we had our client was the redeveloper. And in that process, it was the due diligence element, it was the risk transfer for dealing with remediation, identifying the remediation goals with the municipality. And earlier we mentioned the team, right? In that case, the team was our clients, the redevelopers, LSRP, the LSRP from the municipality, the LSRPs from General Dynamics, and it may have been a larger cast of characters than you would typically see in a straight real estate deal, but by putting that team together, it really pushed everything forward and allowed the redevelopment of that site to move quickly and efficiently, and most importantly, with the municipality's blessing.
Land use permitting.
Okay, we're back. Okay, back to me. The land use permitting. Woodbridge, as you may know, surrounded, or nearly surrounded, with water. And a lot of the industrial activity in Woodbridge was centered around the rivers, the Raritan River, the Arthur Kill, Raritan Bay, and a lot of the creeks, Woodbridge Creek especially, going through one of the industrial areas of Woodbridge. When you were performing remediation in those, what I'm going to call special areas, they require permits, because if you were just doing a remediation in a dry area, you're not near wetlands, you're not near the water, you can just go in and you're really dealing with the straight remediation issues. Because of the presence of water in wetlands, there's another regulatory overlay that is associated with performing remediation and oftentimes investigation. So we're just going to cover this real quickly. These two slides, which is the first one deals with Coastal General Permit 11 and the Freshwater Wetlands General Permit number 4, have to do with performing, obviously for the coastal permitting along mean high water or tidal influenced waters, and the Freshwater Wetlands General Permit is for wetlands and transition areas adjacent to wetlands and state open waters. And while there are certainly different regulatory programs and different statutes, I'm putting them together because there's one idea that comes through, is you can get a general permit to perform that remediation. And in the old days, it required DEP approval. So you needed to coordinate with DEP permitting, but you also had to coordinate with DEP site remediation. You don't have to do that now. Now, for the general permits, you need the LSRP, and this is both for the coastal permit and for the wetlands permit, to demonstrate in writing that the remediation that's being performed minimizes the impact to the special areas. So if it's a coastal marsh, if it's a beach, if it's a dune, if it's public access, if it's the wetlands, that as long as the LSRP says this is the appropriate remedy for this issue, and to implement this remedy, we minimize the impacts, that allows you to take advantage of that coastal general permit or the wetlands permit. And for the next slide, we talk about the Flood Hazard Area Control Act. Similarly, if you are doing work in an area that is prone to flooding, and with all the water that we have here in Woodbridge, a lot of Woodbridge is subject to flood hazard, yes, it's the same situation. The remediation that's being proposed has to be consistent with all the administrative and technical requirements, but also has to minimize the impact to flooding concerns. So if anyone is undertaking remediation here in Woodbridge, be sensitive to these land use permitting issues. And as a consequence of some of the land use permitting associated with brownfield sites, you can also work with the municipality, because there are, through the regulatory process, requirements for public access. And we may touch upon this, I believe, for the CPV project, for what ended up being a tremendous waterfront park that Woodbridge obtained, really through the brownfield and permitting process.
Okay, keep talking.
Oh, for CPV? Maybe, Caroline, if you just want to talk briefly about the park that you ended up with.
Right. So as the mayor started off the morning talking about the EPIC site, which was really probably our most highly contaminated site, it actually even had radioactive material on it. And we worked very closely with DEP because we were a brownfield development area. Normally, you get money through a brownfield development area, but because we had responsible property owners, we didn't get any money, but what we did get was DEP coordination, a point person in the department, which really kept our permits moving very, very quickly. So one of the things that the mayor negotiated and worked out was a balanced redevelopment, where on one piece of it we have the power plant, and on the back piece we have the waterfront park. And it's going to have walkways, and for the first time, it's hard to believe that in Woodbridge, you can't go up to that river and take a look at it. You can't see it. Now you're going to be able to go there, and not only is Epic redeveloping it, but on a volunteer basis, their next door neighbor, Federal Business Centers, is going to expand it so that it'll go from the Edison border all the way over through the Epic property. So it's a great benefit for the township.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, so we talked about the Site Remediation Reform Act. Peak participates in various stakeholder groups, including the Licensed Site Remediation Professionals Association and the NJDEP Site Remediation Advisory Group. And through that participation, we're aware of changes that are coming down the pike for the Site Remediation Reform Act. It's almost 10 years old, and the next version is anticipated to be released next year. So some of those changes, we hope, will include an extension of the circle of bona fide prospective purchaser protection to the state level, some relief from certain remediation requirements for people who voluntarily enter the program. One of the bottlenecks of my job as an LSRP right now is that I still have to go to the state when we're applying for those remedial action permits that we talked about that allow contamination to remain in place. It can stay in place, but it has to do so under a permit, and DEP still reviews those permit applications and issues those permits. That process still takes months, and that's too long. So we're hoping for either pie in the sky hope that LSRPs will be given the right to be able, and control to be able to issue those permits themselves. I think that's unlikely. What's more likely to happen is some kind of regulatory time frame that's reduced for DEP's review of those permits. Increased use, we're hoping for an expanded use of alternative fill and dredge materials. That program has worked very well. We want to expand that. And we want to see exit ramps for parties who are in direct oversight. What direct oversight means is if a responsible party, a PRCR, does not meet a regulatory time frame, they're, on paper, automatically back in the old world, where they have a DEP case manager who's directing the remediation, telling them what to do. Nobody wants to go back to that world. And the double whammy there is that they also still need to hire an LSRP. So they got to pay DEP, they got to listen to DEP, and they got to retain an LSRP and listen to them as well. We're hoping that there can be an exit ramp for those people. Once they come back into compliance, they should be able to get back under the traditional oversight, which is now LSRP oversight. And then we're hoping for an extension of the affidavit of merit that's given to other professionals, medical professionals, PEs. We're hoping that's extended to LSRPs. And then in general, we're hoping for more flexibility and more risk-based decision-making for LSRPs.
Okay, so just a few words jumping back to getting a development going and on the tracks. Financial incentives that are available from government agencies are generally broken down by applicant type. Public entities have access to some pretty significant grant money from the DEP through their Hazardous Discharge Site Remediation Fund. This money can be used to characterize a site and then remediate it. So this would include some of those preliminary steps for defining the project path, so to speak, and that's a preliminary assessment, a site investigation, and a remedial investigation. And then there's money as well to actually do the remediation. These are also backed up by some low-interest loans that are available if there's still financial gaps. So the source of funds is really pretty broad for public entities, and they can even go to EDA for additional funding. There's Green Acres money out there, environmental and infrastructure money. DOT has programs, and there's also federal sources if you want to get that deep in the weeds. So a little bit of effort can really go a long way for a public entity. On the private side, not so much from DEP. The HDSRF fund limits grants to just the remedial action step and only covers up to 25%. All of the HDSRF funding does have cap limits on them, and they recently imposed back in January some schedules on how quickly you have to spend the money. I guess in the past they found that they're allocating all this money for these projects and they're actually not moving. So they actually put time frames on when you have to complete each of these steps and how quickly you need to have shovel and ground to get the project moving.
But the bigger bucket really for the private side is really a more traditional reimbursement program where you define the tax revenues that the redevelopment is going to generate, and based on generation of those taxes, when the redevelopment is done, you get reimbursed of up to 75%. Again, the key is early planning. You want your LSRP involved very early, because a key component of these applications is definitely the scope of the project, the cost of the project, and the schedule of the project. And then you also want to contact your local development official, like we've already mentioned, so you can get the local lay of the land to make sure you don't start off with any immediate conflicts in terms of getting things moving. And then when you develop that preliminary plan locally, then you go to DEP to get an initial financial plan and bigger plan in terms of getting your project moving.
So in closing, as Jeff said, the metrics before, the LSRP program has been a huge success. Our team approach, the tools we have in our tool belt, the additional remedial options really result in a faster completion time for projects. The financial incentives that Jeff just mentioned can get these brownfield projects off the ground and running. And the environmental liabilities that those brownfield sites represent get to be managed. And again, Woodbridge is really ahead of the pack, and they've transformed the vast majority of their brownfield sites into golden business opportunities. And those opportunities benefit the state, the township, and the community. And that's the end of our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there are a lot of people in this room from the engineering world and the legal world who have helped Woodbridge be so successful in our redevelopment. So I want to thank all of you who have played a role in that. And if you think you have, please stand up. Everybody's going to be shy. I know there's about a third of this room has been involved with it. It's okay. It's okay.
You could have Donna stand up.
So thank you, gentlemen. It was a great show. Are there any questions?
I'll throw the first question out there. So it's for Rob and Jeff. When good LSRPs disagree, is there a process right now? And earlier we mentioned having talk about regional contamination or contamination migrating from one site to another site. So LSRP for site 1, LSRP for site 2, LSRP for site 1 says, you know, this groundwater contamination is coming from site 2. Or there's a commingled plume, and the other LSRP says no. Is there a process now for resolving those disputes?
Go ahead. In the past, there's always been I've forgotten the name of it, but it was some sort of technical board at DEP that you could go to resolve these kinds of issues. And that was typically a dispute between the consultant and the DEP in terms of what the issue is. I'm not aware right now of any formal process that's available to LSRPs to resolve this type of thing.
Yeah, that process doesn't exist anymore. You can meet with DEP and you can have a technical consult with them, but DEP absolutely, vehemently will not be the arbitrator of a situation. They will not get involved in it. And so I think someone like Larry or firms like Valence, you're hiring an environmental attorney to really moderate that dispute.
One of the things with our Brownfield development area, we had stakeholders where everybody who was in that neighborhood of KSB came and would sit and have meetings and talk to each other. And I always said that they were great neighbors. They shared everything, including their contamination. But it was because we had all the stakeholders sitting at the table that they started to be able to communicate with each other and say, okay, these elements look very much like what you have on your property, so you need to take care of that, and we'll take care of this. And they built a pool to actually hold a lot of the contaminants, and this wall included not just Epic's property, but the property of their next door neighbor. So working together, even shared contamination can be cleaned up. Any other questions? Yes.
A couple of
I do want to say, having been very involved in HDSRF, just remember that the revenues, the grants that are available are generated by a percentage of corporate business tax. So we're in a very good economy right now, and there were recent legislative changes that expanded the types of properties that can get at that money. So now is the time, as we like to say, try to make land in New Jersey, not a whole lot. Now is the time to really be talking to the municipality to see whether or not you can and they can take advantage of those opportunities. Another thing that's very important, the reforms that are going on, you may have described them as pie in the sky, and that's probably true for what you had listed up there, although I would certainly love to see that for my career. And there are other reforms that are happening in the interim, so you should be paying attention to some changes that are out there that may come very quickly that will impact some really critical areas of the law, like who has a reporting obligation and how multiple levels are needed to talk to each other on site and others. And finally, there was a huge rule adoption in August that defined the term person, which basically boils down to who's responsible on site to include a managing member of an LLC. So I'm curious for the panel how you have sort of dealt with that reality that many of your clients are LLCs and they have to sign a certification every time a report goes in, which is changing.
I think that's best for you, Larry.
Oh, sure. So with the changes, and the last question I want to take last, because the HDSRF program is constantly evolving with DEP and the where that money is being allocated to. Jeff had previously mentioned how it was being, in the past, there were opportunities for remediating parties to take advantage of that program. As that program has evolved, and certainly within, I would say, the last 2 years, the opportunities for private parties to take advantage of that, even though the money is coming in through the corporate business tax, the opportunities for private parties to really take advantage is diminishing, and it really puts the emphasis on municipalities and other public entities to do that. On the certifications associated with all submissions to DEP, so all submissions, right? Anything that the LSRP is submitting to DEP usually comes with another submission, a certification by the party who's performing the remediation. And so by extending the certification to the persons and the managing members, the emphasis makes sure that the LSRP and the client are all on the same page, that they know what is being submitted is accurate, reflective, and let's face it, those managing members are relying solely on the LSRPs for that information, because the managing members don't usually know what the contamination was or whether it was performed properly, but they rely on the LSRP, so it tightens that relationship between the LSRP and the client, and to make sure that they're all comfortable with each other, that the client chose the right LSRP, and that the LSRP is right for the project. And as Susan mentioned, you know, the opportunities for lawyers to get involved are probably not as frequent and not as intensive as it used to be, which is good for the regulated community. But that's another example of where the attorneys really should get involved to make sure that everyone is on the same page when signing those certifications. Because those certifications to DEP do come with enforcement and penalties in the event that the information turns out to be inaccurate.
Right. And one other thing, at the end of the day, LSRPs are not attorneys, so especially on complicated projects, we always recommend to a new customer, an existing customer, that they pull an environmental attorney onto the team to just just to stay away from bear traps, really.
So as interesting as this is, I think we all have to get back to work. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
It's very, very informative. Thank you, everybody, for coming.